It was the kind of night that crept quietly over the foothills, crisp, still, and deceptively peaceful. The lights of Fort Collins glowed faintly against the deep Colorado sky, and most of the town was already asleep. On October 22, 2005, a soft wind brushed through the cottonwoods along Mulberry Street as 30-year-old Rachel Monroe closed the doors of her small downtown bookstore for the last time that evening. Rachel's shop, the Paper Lantern, sat on the corner of a narrow brick-lined block near Old Town Square. Locals loved her place for its warmth, the smell of coffee, the jazz that played quietly in the background, and Rachel herself, always smiling from behind the counter. She was the kind of person who remembered birthdays, left handwritten notes in people's books, and dropped soup off for sick neighbors. That Saturday night, she was supposed to meet her best friend, Maya Reynolds, for dinner after closing. But when 9 o'clock came and Rachel didn't show, Maya figured she might still be busy balancing receipts, something she often stayed late to do. When 10 o'clock passed with no answer to calls or texts, Maya drove to Rachel's small rental home on the east side of town. The porch light was off. Rachel's car sat parked neatly in the driveway. Everything looked normal, except the front door, which was slightly ajar. Maya called her name. No response. Inside, the living room looked untouched. A book still open on the couch, a cup of tea half finished on the coffee table. But as she stepped deeper into the house, her heart began to race. A single lamp lay shattered in the hallway, and one of Rachel's shoes was overturned near the kitchen doorway. Then, from the darkness beyond, came the faint hum of the refrigerator and silence. Maya dialed 911. Her voice trembled as she told the dispatcher, "My friend's house. Something's wrong. I think someone's been here." Within minutes, Fort Collins police cruisers lit up the quiet residential street. Neighbors peeked through curtains as officers secured the scene. Inside, they found Rachel's body in the kitchen. She had been attacked, likely surprised as she entered from the living room. There were signs of struggle, an overturned chair, a broken wine glass, traces of blood near the counter. But there were no signs of forced entry. Whoever came inside either had a key or had been let in. Detective Aaron Kessler, a veteran investigator with 20 years on the force, arrived just after midnight. He'd seen his share of violence, but something about the stillness of the little house unsettled him. "This wasn't random," he said quietly to his partner, Detective Leela Hahn, as they stood over the scene. She knew who did this. The evidence was puzzling. Rachel's purse still sat on the counter, her wallet untouched, and her phone remained plugged in on the nightstand. No valuables were missing. What they did find was a faint smear of blood on the doorknob and a partial print on a ceramic mug near the sink, smudged and incomplete. The coroner's report came back 2 days later. Rachel had died from blunt force trauma to the head, likely caused by a heavy household object. The blow had been sudden from behind. Defensive wounds on her arm suggested she'd fought back. Time of death: between 9:10 and 9:40 p.m., Kessler and Hahn began building a timeline. Rachel had closed her store around 8:30 p.m. Security footage from a nearby shop showed her locking up, carrying a tote bag and her usual leather satchel. She stopped at a gas station a few blocks away, smiled at the cashier, and bought a bottle of wine, the same one shattered on her kitchen floor. After that, she vanished into the night. The first week of the investigation consumed the town. Flyers went up on telephone poles. Vigils were held outside the bookstore, and locals came forward with stories. People who'd seen Rachel earlier that day, customers who adored her, friends who couldn't imagine anyone wanting to hurt her. But detectives soon discovered cracks beneath the surface. Rachel had recently broken off a brief relationship with a man named Evan Clark, a former graduate student from Colorado State University who had been renting an apartment near her bookstore. According to Maya, the relationship had ended only 3 weeks earlier after Evan became too controlling. Rachel had confided that she felt uneasy, that Evan had shown up at her shop unannounced, once even waited outside her house. When police brought him in for questioning, Evan appeared calm, even polite. He admitted to dating Rachel, but denied any involvement in her death. "We argued, sure," he said, "but I didn't kill her. I cared about her." His alibi seemed solid. He'd been at a friend's birthday dinner in Denver that night with several witnesses to back him up. Investigators collected his fingerprints and DNA as standard procedure. Nothing matched the partial print from the mug. Another potential suspect emerged, a maintenance worker named Tom Jeffries, who serviced several properties in Rachel's neighborhood. He had a minor criminal record for trespassing and had reportedly done repairs at her house 2 weeks before the murder. When questioned, Jeffries denied any wrongdoing and insisted he'd been working late across town. His prints also failed to match. The case grew colder by the day. Months passed. The state crime lab analyzed the partial fingerprint from the mug repeatedly, but could not get a viable match. The smudge was too faint, the ridge pattern incomplete. Even with enhancement, it couldn't be identified. DNA swabs collected from under Rachel's fingernails produced mixed results, inconclusive due to degradation. Detective Hahn believed the killer had cleaned up after the attack. "He knew what he was doing," she said. "He left nothing behind," but Kessler wasn't convinced. "Nobody leaves nothing," he muttered often. "Something's here, we just haven't seen it yet." By 2006, with no new leads, the investigation slowed. Forensic technology at the time had its limits, and local resources were stretched thin. Kessler kept the file on his desk for months, refusing to archive it. He'd revisit the photos, the notes, the evidence logs. The mug always caught his attention, the one with the faint print. It sat in an evidence box marked Item 7A. In 2008, after another unsolved year, Rachel's case was officially moved to cold case status. The paper lantern closed shortly after, its windows dark and dusty. Maya moved to Denver, unable to walk past the corner without breaking down. Rachel's parents, who lived in Boulder, held yearly memorials at the park by City Lake. The community never forgot her, but time, as it always does, blurred the details. Detective Kessler retired in 2014. Before leaving, he placed the Monroe file in the cold case archive, labeled in faded ink, "Unsolved, pending advancement in forensic technology." He didn't know that advancement was coming. In 2023, nearly 18 years later, Fort Collins Police launched a statewide initiative to re-examine old homicide evidence using new digital enhancement tools. One of the cases selected was Rachel Monroe's. Among the box of old files and photos was that same ceramic mug, still carefully sealed in its evidence bag. When the lab technician placed it under a new high-resolution scanner, the computer detected something invisible to the naked eye: microscopic ridge patterns beneath the smudge, preserved under layers of time and dust, a hidden fingerprint, one that had never been seen before. The system began reconstructing the image pixel by pixel, mapping the partial print against the national database. At 2:47 a.m., the screen flashed "Match found," and with that, the quiet city of Fort Collins, the town that had mourned and moved on, was about to learn that the killer they'd long forgotten had been hiding in plain sight all along when the alert flashed. Across the forensic lab's screen that morning, technician Erin Walsh almost thought it was a system error. The computer displayed a partial fingerprint image reconstructed from the ceramic mug collected in 2005, faint but distinct. The algorithm had enhanced and filled in ridge details invisible to the old scanners, creating a nearly complete print. She leaned closer, frowning. "That can't be right," she murmured. The match came back to Samuel Sam Keller, age 48, a longtime resident of Fort Collins, and more shockingly, a former police evidence technician. His employment record showed he'd worked in the same department from 1998 to 2009. the exact period during which Rachel Monroe's case had been investigated. Erin reread the data twice, pulse quickening. Keller had no known connection to Rachel, no criminal record, no prior red flags. But his fingerprint, his hidden fingerprint, was on the mug found next to her body. She immediately called her supervisor. Within an hour, the cold case unit had reopened the file. Detective Lila Hahn, now a senior investigator, returned to the department's downtown office to oversee the re-examination. When she saw Keller's name on the report, she went silent for a long moment. "Keller worked our evidence room," she said finally. "He handled half the homicide files that came through here." That revelation sent shockwaves through the department. Keller had retired quietly in 2009 after a minor workplace injury. No one had ever questioned his integrity. He was known as meticulous, soft-spoken, maybe a little eccentric, but trustworthy. Hahn called the district attorney's office that same afternoon. "We need to reopen everything Keller touched," she told them. A task force assembled within days. They reviewed every report, every chain of custody form Keller had processed during the original investigation. Nothing looked suspicious. Every document was clean. But one thing stood out. Keller had logged in to catalog Rachel Monroe's evidence on October 25, 2005, just 3 days after the murder. He'd been one of the last people to handle that mug. The working theory at first was contamination, that Keller's fingerprint had transferred accidentally during evidence processing. But even that didn't make sense. Evidence techs wore gloves, and Keller had signed off on the chain of custody form, verifying that all protocol had been followed. The partial print was beneath the layer of Rachel's own blood and dust, meaning it had been left before the murder, not after. Hahn leaned back in her chair, a cold realization sinking in. "He didn't contaminate it," she said. "He left it there that night." The implications were staggering. By early May 2023, the team secured a search warrant for Keller's home in Loveland, 20 minutes south of Fort Collins. The quiet suburban neighborhood didn't look like the sort of place that hid monsters. His house sat neat and trimmed behind a line of junipers. When the team arrived, Keller greeted them at the door in slippers, gray-haired, slightly hunched. He appeared confused but calm. "You're here about the Monroe case?" he asked as if he already knew. Inside, the home was tidy, almost sterile. Books stacked by category, curtains drawn halfway. A faint smell of bleach lingered in the air. The search turned up several disturbing items. Among them, a storage box marked archives containing police reports, photocopies of witness statements, and evidence photos from Rachel's case. These weren't official duplicates. They had been taken without authorization. Even more chilling was a manila envelope labeled "Personal Notes." Inside were pages written in neat handwriting, filled with observations about Rachel, her bookstore, her daily routines, even what time she usually turned off the lights at home. Keller had been watching her. Detectives realized with dawning horror that he'd likely crossed paths with Rachel often without her knowing. His notes suggested he'd visited her bookstore multiple times before her death, describing her in detached analytical tones. Polite, kind, reserved. Noticing she closes shop alone most nights. Mentioned she lives near the university. Walks home around 9. These weren't random curiosities. They were surveillance notes. Keller was arrested that evening on suspicion of homicide. During the interrogation, he remained eerily composed. Detective Hahn sat across from him in the interview room, recorder running. "Sam, your fingerprint was found on a mug inside Rachel Monroe's home. We can prove it predates the evidence handling. Can you explain how that's possible?" He tilted his head slightly, lips twitching in what almost looked like amusement. "That's not possible," he said. "I never knew her." "You wrote about her," Hahn countered, sliding the photocopied notes across the table. "You followed her." He didn't touch the papers. "Those were professional observations," he said. "For training." We were studying community behavior patterns. It's called routine activity profiling. Hahn stared at him. You were an evidence tech, Sam, not a profiler. For the first time, his eyes flickered. I admired her, he said finally. That's all. Over the next few hours, his story shifted again and again, from denial to admiration to confusion. When confronted with the fact that his fingerprint was preserved under the victim's blood layer, he went silent. He leaned back in his chair, looking almost tired. Maybe I was there before, he whispered. Maybe I was supposed to protect her. Protect her from what? Hahn pressed. He didn't answer. Forensics continued analyzing items found in his home. On a USB drive hidden behind a false panel in his office desk, investigators discovered several photos of women taken from a distance, in parking lots, at stores, near homes. One was Rachel Monroe. The metadata dated the image 3 weeks before her death. It was enough for a murder charge. The arrest stunned the community. Newspapers across Colorado ran the headline, "Former police evidence tech arrested in 2005 homicide." The department faced intense scrutiny. How could a man entrusted with preserving truth have used that access to hide his own crime? But for Hahn and her team, the real challenge lay ahead, proving beyond doubt that Keller hadn't just mishandled evidence, but had actually killed Rachel. They reconstructed the timeline. In 2005, Keller was working late nights cataloging evidence in another case and lived just 2 blocks from Rachel's house. He would have known the area, the routines, and how investigations unfolded. He knew precisely what to wipe, what to clean, what to leave untouched. He had been hiding in the open, a predator behind a badge. When confronted with this theory, Keller didn't protest. He simply asked one question: what finally gave me away? Hahn replied, "A fingerprint you couldn't see." He smiled faintly. "Then I guess I didn't clean well enough." After nearly 2 decades of silence, the Monroe case roared back into headlines. Old detectives like Aaron Kessler were called in for review. When Kessler learned who the suspect was, he reportedly sat in his kitchen for nearly an hour, stunned. "All those years," he said later, "I thought the print was our missing piece. I never imagined it was one of ours." The trial preparations began almost immediately. Forensics experts were tasked with explaining how new fingerprint enhancement technology had made the breakthrough. A technique capable of detecting oil and amino acid traces embedded beneath surface contamination. But before the trial could begin, investigators uncovered one more clue hidden in Keller's files. A small, folded note written in Rachel's handwriting. It was dated the week before her murder. "Sam, please stop visiting my shop. It's making me uncomfortable. I don't want to get the police involved, but I will if this continues. Rachel." The note was never reported at the time. Keller had kept it, folded neatly in a plastic sleeve, for 18 years, and suddenly, everything about that October night, the unlocked door, the lack of forced entry, the quiet familiarity between them, started to make terrible sense. The morning of January 9th, 2024, dawned gray and bitterly cold in Larimer County. Snow had drifted up against the courthouse steps, and the air carried that muted stillness that always seemed to accompany moments of reckoning. Inside, the seats were filled. Reporters, retired officers, families of old victims. All had gathered for the trial of Samuel Keller, the quiet man whose secret had cracked open an 18-year-old mystery. Detective Lila Hahn sat in the front row of the prosecution's side. The faces around her were familiar yet changed, older, wearier. Beside her sat Aaron Kessler, the original investigator on the case, who'd retired from active duty years earlier. His hands trembled slightly as he held a folded piece of paper, Rachel Monroe's last known letter, the one Keller had kept hidden for nearly 2 decades. Keller entered the courtroom escorted by 2 deputies. His hair was now white, neatly combed, his glasses perched low on his nose. He looked more like a retired librarian than a man accused of murder. Yet the hush that followed his arrival was thick with disbelief. When the judge called the court to order, the prosecutor, Marianne Decker, rose. She was known for her calm, deliberate voice, the kind that carried authority without needing to shout. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "this case is not about speculation. It is about evidence. Evidence that lay waiting for nearly 2 decades until science and persistence revealed what the human eye could not." She turned toward Keller briefly. The defendant, Samuel Keller, was trusted to protect justice. Instead, he used his position to hide from it. The defense attorney, Mark Ellison, countered that Keller was being made a scapegoat for the department's old mistakes. "My client dedicated his life to the meticulous care of evidence," Ellison argued. "He didn't manipulate it, he preserved it." The fingerprint? A contamination error, nothing more. But as the prosecution began its case, that narrative began to crumble. The jury watched as forensic expert Erin Walsh demonstrated how the new enhancement technology, called subsurface ridge recovery, had revealed oil residue embedded below layers of dust and dried fluid. She explained how the print, preserved on the mug, existed before the surface contamination from blood and environmental decay. "The fingerprint," she said, projecting an image on the courtroom screen, "was not transferred during evidence handling. It was imprinted during the crime itself." The jurors leaned forward, their eyes fixed on the enlarged ridges that had once been invisible. Then came the photographs from Keller's home, pages of notes describing Rachel's habits, the hidden USB drive with surveillance photos, and finally, the folded letter. Each item deepened the silence in the courtroom. When Decker displayed the letter on the overhead, the words seemed to echo in every mind. "Please stop visiting my shop. It's making me uncomfortable." The room stayed still. Rachel's handwriting was gentle, almost hesitant, the plea of a woman trying to maintain civility even in fear. Han stared at it, jaw clenched. She had read that note a dozen times, but every viewing reopened the wound. The defense tried to undermine the forensics, suggesting that the new fingerprint recovery method was too novel, too untested. "We're talking about microscopic oil traces under a microscope," Ellison said. But the prosecution had anticipated that argument. They brought in Dr. Charles Redmond, a fingerprint analysis pioneer from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, who calmly dismantled the doubt. "What you see here," he explained, "isn't interpretation. It's replication." The print was digitally reconstructed using confirmed ridge detail that matches Keller's right index finger with a confidence level of 1 in 18.7 billion. That's not conjecture. That's math. For a long time after that testimony, the courtroom stayed silent. Then, in an unexpected twist, the prosecution called Keller himself to testify. His lawyer objected, but Keller agreed to speak, insisting he wanted to clear the record. He took the stand and adjusted the microphone, his hand steady despite the gravity of what hung in the air. "Mr. Keller," Decker began softly, "did you know Rachel Monroe?" He looked down for a long moment before answering. "No, not personally. Did you ever visit her bookstore?" "I might have. I don't remember." Decker leaned forward. "You wrote about her. You followed her. You had her schedule, her address. You kept a letter she wrote asking you to leave her alone." He blinked slowly, expression unreadable. "I kept a lot of things. Did you kill her?" The air in the room tightened. Keller paused. Then, in a flat tone, he said, "I didn't mean for it to happen that way." The sentence hit like a gunshot. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Han closed her eyes. Decker didn't speak for several seconds. Then quietly, "Tell us what you meant." Keller's voice cracked slightly. "I was supposed to talk to her, just talk. I thought she liked the visits. I didn't think she was afraid." He swallowed, eyes unfocused. "But when she said she'd tell someone, I panicked. I just wanted her to stop screaming." Gasps spread across the room. The judge immediately called for silence. Decker said nothing further. She didn't need to. The confession, though partial, was enough. Keller was led off the stand, his shoulders slumped, his face drained of color. The jury's expressions were a mix of shock and sorrow, some visibly shaken by how ordinary he seemed. When the verdict came days later, it was swift. Guilty of first-degree murder. Hahn attended the sentencing hearing, sitting quietly in the back as the judge read the final order: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. In her statement to the press afterward, she said, "We trusted him to guard truth, but truth outlasts even the ones who bury it." Rachel's story is proof of that. For Rachel Monroe's family, the verdict brought a strange, fragile peace. Her brother, Michael Monroe, spoke outside the courthouse. "It doesn't bring her back," he said softly, "but knowing he can't hurt anyone else, knowing she wasn't forgotten, means something. She deserved this." Later that night, Hahn returned to the evidence room, the same one Keller once supervised. She stood among the shelves of boxed cases, the fluorescent lights humming faintly above. She opened Rachel's file, now sealed and labeled Closed, Solved 2023. For a moment, she traced her hand over the label. Then she whispered almost to herself, "We finally got you home, Rachel." In the quiet, she felt something like closure, but also a weight. The realization that every file in those shelves held another story like Rachel's, waiting for science, persistence, or chance to unlock them. Outside, snow began to fall again over Fort Collins, soft and relentless, and somewhere deep in the records of the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, the fingerprint that cracked the case was preserved, not just as evidence, but as a reminder that even the smallest trace, the faintest ridge, can carry the weight of truth across decades. The razor-wire fence surrounding the Colorado State Penitentiary shimmered under the pale winter sun. Snow clung to its edges, and the dry mountain air bit through the silence as a line of inmates crossed the yard for morning count. Among them, dressed in gray, head down, shuffled Samuel Keller. Gone was the calm posture of the evidence technician who once spoke with quiet authority about order and procedure. In prison, his world was reduced to strict routines: meals at 6, work detail at 9, lights out by 10. His cell, small and windowless, held only a cot, a shelf of books, and a bulletin board pinned with a single piece of paper, a copy of his own sentencing order. He rarely spoke. Guards described him as obedient, quiet, and detached, though some said he seemed to watch people more than he interacted with them, a habit that made others uneasy. But outside those walls, Keller's name had become something larger, a symbol of betrayal inside the system that trusted him. Detective Lila Hahn, now nearing her 20th year in law enforcement, testified before a Colorado legislative panel in the spring of 2024. The hearing focused on proposed reforms for evidence handling and cold case protocols. Cameras lined the panel room, and news outlets carried her testimony live. She began with a statement that hushed the room. "The most dangerous flaw in any justice system is not technology or manpower, it's assumption. We assumed our colleagues couldn't be suspects. We assumed integrity meant immunity, and that assumption nearly buried a young woman's truth for life." The Keller case had shaken the state's confidence in its own forensic systems. An internal audit revealed that between 1998 and 2009, Keller had managed evidence for more than 320 homicide investigations across Colorado.